Hey folks, I'm Sam Luce here at NA Studios with a video for NOIZ Hub. Now, I want to take a look today at how we can observe different areas of our mix and where different areas are going to create issues. Now, I've highlighted 5 areas here that could create problems in your mix, which instruments are going to be sitting within these areas and how we can rectify these problems. So if you have these kind of issues in your mix, this is one for you to take a look at. Let's jump in. So first off, I want to talk about the low end, and this is where the kick and the bass guitar is going to be sitting in this particular mix. It may be that in your mix it's got some synth or perhaps some low end of guitars, but for me it's predominantly the bass and the kick. So this is in the kind of 100 hertz area. I'm just going to solo this band so you can hear exactly what's going on. So if this area is a problem for you, then there's a couple of things you can do. You could use a compressor, which is side chained. So you put a compressor on the bass and then side chain in the kick drum. That means that whenever the kick drum hits, it's going to duck down slightly on the bass. And that means that your kick is going to punch through. You could also do this with dynamic EQ. So you could just notch out a little bit of the bottom end. Whenever that kick hits, it's going to notch out a little bit of that low end and allow your punchy kick to come through and take up that low end information. Now next we have the low mid information. Here I've got this at around 250 hertz. This is maybe going to vary depending on what instruments you've got, but this is the real meat of everything. This is where you can really make or break the overall fullness of the mix. Too much in this area, it's going to sound muddy. Not enough, it's going to sound empty. Let's take a listen to what's sitting within this frequency range. So there, for me, it's really the low end of the snare and the low end of the guitars. Now, this is kind of a pop punk track, so the guitars are quite chuggy. There's quite a lot of palm muting going on here. For me, if I've got too much muddiness in this area, then there's a couple of things I can try, which are kind of similar to what we did in the low end. I can use that side chain again. So I can sidechain in the snare to the bus that's on the guitars and just duck down the low end on those guitars slightly when that snare hits. But for me, this is definitely going to be a frequency dependent thing. I'm not going to use a compressor for this. I'm not going to use a full band compressor. I just want to compress those low mids. So I'd be using a multi-band compressor or a dynamic EQ to just notch out some of that low mid information when the snare hits to allow it to poke through. But crucially, we're not going to be affecting the top end or the higher mid range of the guitars because that's going to be noticeable. With side chains, with the bass and that kind of low mids, we don't want to be able to notice that we're using those compression effects. We just want to feel the effect. We don't want to hear the compression. We just want to utilize the good parts of what's actually happening. So if we're using a full band compressor there, we're going to be taking out too much of the high end of the guitars. It's going to be noticeable. That's not what we want. So I'd just be using a multi-band compressor there just to notch out a little bit of the bottom end when that snare hits. Now this area around 1K is really where the mix can be made or lost. Just take a listen to what is actually in this area of the frequency spectrum. So much of the main part of the mix is in this spectrum. We've got a lot of the vocal, we've got a lot of the guitars, a lot of the snare. 3 really core instruments in this mix are occupying this space. So here's what I would do here. If we're looking at the 1 kilohertz area and we've got too much of kind of all the instruments there, I would start spreading things out. So I would do a slight dip at 1 kilohertz on perhaps the snare and perhaps the vocal as well, and a slight peak at 1K on the guitars. And then do the opposite for another frequency, say 2 kilohertz. Perhaps we could add some 2K to the vocal and take it out of the guitars and the snare. This is an example of frequency masking where too many instruments are occupying the same space. So by compensating for this with EQ cuts and boosts, we're allowing each of these instruments to fit into its own compartment. We're allowing the snare to perhaps fit into that 1K area and then cutting it out in those other instruments, allowing the vocal to sit in that 2K area and cutting it out in the other instruments. It's going to leave you with a mix that sounds far clearer. You're not going to have as much masking, and ultimately you're going to be able to hear everything in your mix as you should be able to. Now the 3K area is absolutely crucial for your vocal. Let's take a listen to what's sitting within this area. So the vocal is really dominant there, and depending on the kind of voice that you've got here, it's quite a high tenor voice, but it's sitting firmly in that 3K area. So I would go a bit bigger here. I would create a bus that's got every single instrument on it other than your vocal. So everything is just being bussed to this, not just as a bus send, but the output of every track is going to this one bus. Call it the instrument bus. And then on this bus, apply a dynamic EQ to sit around in that 3 kilohertz area and sidechain in your vocal. You really want to go big here because you want that vocal to cut through. If there's any one word that you can't hear in that vocal, it's a problem. The vocal is the star of the show. So you can apply this dynamic EQ so that it ducks out the way just slightly whenever the vocal is present. Turn it off, turn it on, listen to the difference. This is really going to make your vocal shine through. Now for the high end, this is where the cymbals, the top end of the vocal and the top end of the guitar or perhaps the synth is going to live. Let's take a listen to this, which is kind of the 8 kilohertz and above area. Now, too much of this area can create a shrillness to the mix, but not enough can leave everything sounding a bit too dull and really take the life out of the mix. You need to work out which instrument really needs to dominate that area. In this mix, the vocal is important there, but the cymbals need to live there as well. So here's what I would do. I would create some de-esser instances on all of these instruments. Make it so that it's cutting off some of the top end and not just a mid band. Make it so it's affecting that 8K and above area. Have the de-esser affecting all of these instruments that sit in that area, but just by a small amount. If you've got the vocal that needs to sit on top of everything, don't have that de-essed as much as the other instruments that occupy that area. If the cymbals need to be the most forward, have that de-essed the least. What this means is that when those instruments need to be heard, they're able to be heard. But when they need to be tamed, when things are getting just a little bit too much in the high end, they're just going to be tamed slightly. This is going to overall create some silkiness to your mix. It's going to make sure the top end is not getting too harsh, not too aggressive. Make sure you have a nice, smooth mix where every single instrument can be heard. A few tips there for you, 5 areas that are really crucial to your mix and ways that you can combat any issues that may arise in instruments that sit within these mix areas. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you soon. Take care.